Besides, she had stopped at the Palmer House with her husband, and she knew how buyers were likely to be besieged by eager salesmen with cards, and with tempting lines of goods spread knowingly in the various sample rooms. Fanny Brandeis was 13 and emotional, and incredibly receptive and alive. It is impossible to tell what she learned during that Chicago trip. It was so crowded, so wonderful. She went with her mother to the wholesale houses and heard and saw and unconsciously remembered. When she became fatigued with the close air of the dim showrooms, with their endless aisles piled with every sort of ware, she would sit on a chair in some obscure corner, watching those sleek, over-lunch, genial-looking salesmen who were chewing their cigars somewhat wildly when Mrs. Brandeis finished with them. Sometimes she did not accompany her mother, but lay in bed, deliciously, until the middle of the morning, then dressed and chatted with the obliging Irish chambermaid, and read until her mother came for her at noon. Everything she did was a delightful adventure. Everything she saw had the tang of novelty. Fanny Brandeis was to see much that was beautiful and rare in her full lifetime, but she never again, perhaps, got quite the thrill that those ugly, dim, red-carpeted, gas-lighted hotel corridors gave her, or the grim bedroom with its walnut furniture and its Nottingham curtains. As for the Chicago streets themselves, with their perilous corners, there were no czars in blue to regulate traffic in those days. Older and more sophisticated pedestrians experienced various emotions while negotiating the corner of State and Madison. That buying trip lasted 10 days. It was a racking business, physically and mentally. There were the hours of tramping up one aisle and down the other in the big wholesale lofts. But that brought bodily fatigue only. It was the mental strain that left Mrs. Brandeis spent and limp at the end of the day. Was she buying wisely? Was she overbuying? What did she know about buying anyway? She would come back to her hotel at 6, sometimes so exhausted that the dining room and dinner were unthinkable. At such times they would have dinner in their room, another delicious adventure for Fanny. She would try to tempt the fagged woman on the bed with bits of this or that from one of the many dishes that dotted the dinner tray. But Molly Brandeis, harrowed in spirit and numbed in body, was too spent to eat. But that was not always the case. There was that unforgettable night when they went to see Bernhardt the divine. Fanny spent the entire morning following, standing before the bedroom mirror, with her hair pulled out in a wild fluff in front, her mother's old marten fur scarf high and choky around her neck, trying to smile that slow, sad, poignant, tear-compelling smile. But she had to give it up, clever mimic though she was. She only succeeded in looking as though a pin were sticking her somewhere. Besides, Fanny's own smile was a quick, broad, flashing grin, with a generous glint of white teeth in it, and she always forgot about being exquisitely wistful over it until it was too late. I wonder if the story of the China religious figures will give a wrong impression of Mrs. Brandeis. Perhaps not, if you will only remember this woman's white-lipped determination to wrest a livelihood from the world, for her children and herself. They had been in Chicago a week, and she was buying at Bowder and Peck's. Now Bowder and Peck importers are known the world over. It is doubtful if there is one of you who has not been supplied, indirectly, with some imported bit of china or glassware, with French opera glasses or cunning toys and dolls, from the great New York and Chicago showrooms of that company. Young Bowder himself was waiting on Mrs. Brandeis, and he was frowning because he hated to sell women. Young Bowder was being broken into the Chicago end of the business, and he was not taking gracefully to the process. At the end of a long aisle, on an obscure shelf in a dim corner, Molly Brandeis's sharp eyes espied a motley collection of dusty, grimy china figures, of the kind one sees on the mantel in the parlor of the small-town Catholic home. Winnebago's population was 2/3 Catholic, German and Irish, and very devout. Mrs. Brandeis stopped short. "How much for that lot?" She pointed to the shelf. Young Bowder's gaze followed hers, puzzled. The figures were from 5 inches to a foot high, in crude, effective blues and gold, and crimson and white. All the saints were there in assorted sizes. The Pieta, the cradle in the manger. There were probably 200 or more of the little figures. "Oh, those," said young Bowder vaguely. "You don't want that stuff. Now about that Limoges china. As I said, I can make you a special price on it if you carry it as an open stock pattern. You'll find—" "How much for that lot?" repeated Mrs. Brandeis. "Those are leftover samples, Mrs. Brandeis. Last year's stuff. They are all dirty. I'd forgotten they were there." "How much for the lot?" said Mrs. Brandeis pleasantly, for the 3rd time. "I really don't know. 300, I should say, but—" "I'll give you 200," ventured Mrs. Brandeis. her heart in her mouth, and her mouth very firm. "Oh, come now, Mrs. Brandeis. Bowder and Peck don't do business that way, you know. We'd really rather not sell them at all. The things aren't worth much to us, or to you, for that matter. But 300—" "200," repeated Mrs. Brandeis, "or I cancel my order, including the Limoges. I want those figures." And she got them. Which isn't the point of the story. The holy figures were fine examples of foreign workmanship, their colors, beneath the coating of dust, as brilliant and fadeless as those found in the churches of Europe. They reached Winnebago duly, packed in straw and paper, still dusty and shelf-worn. Mrs. Brandeis and Sadie and Pearl sat on up-ended boxes at the rear of the store, in the big barn-like room in which newly arrived goods were unpacked. As Aloysius dived deep into the crate and brought up figure after figure, the three women plunged them into warm and soapy water and proceeded to bathe and scour the entire school of saints, angels, and cherubim. They came out brilliantly fresh and rosy. All the Irish ingenuity and artistry in Aloysius came to the surface as he dived again and again into the great barrel and brought up the glittering pieces. "It'll make an elegant window," he gasped from the depths of the hay, his lean, lengthy frame jackknifed over the edge. "And cheap!" His shrewd wit had long ago divined the store's price mark. "If Father Fitzpatrick steps by in the forenoon, I'll bet they'll be gone before night time tomorrow. You'll be letting me do the trim, Mrs. Brandeis?" He came back that evening to do it, and he threw his whole soul into it, which, considering his ancestry and temperament, was very high voltage for one small-town store window. He covered the floor of the window with black crepe paper, and hung it in long folds like a curtain against the rear wall. The gilt of the scepters and halos and capes showed up dazzlingly against this background. The scarlets and pinks and blues and whites of the robes appeared doubly bright. The whole made a picture that struck and held you by its vividness and contrast. Father Fitzpatrick, very tall and straight, and handsome, with his iron gray hair and his cheeks pink as a girl's, did step by next morning on his way to the post office. It was whispered that in his youth Father Fitzpatrick had been an actor, and that he had deserted the footlights for the altar lights because of a disappointment. The drama's loss was the church's gain. You should have heard him on Sunday morning, now flaying them, now swaying them. He still had the actor's flexible voice, vibrant, tremulous, or strident at will. And no amount of fasting or praying had ever dimmed that certain something in his eye, the something which makes the matinee idol. Not only did he step by now, he turned, came back, stopped before the window. Then he entered. "Madam," he said to Mrs. Brandeis, "you'll probably save more souls with your window display than I could in a month of hellfire sermons." He raised his hand. "You have the sanction of the church," which was the beginning of a queer friendship between the Roman Catholic priest and the Jewish shopkeeper that lasted as long as Molly Brandeis lived. By noon it seemed that the entire population of Winnebago had turned devout. The figures, a tremendous bargain, though sold at a high profit, seemed to melt away from the counter that held them. By 3 o'clock, "Only one to a customer," announced Mrs. Brandeis. By the middle of the week the window itself was ravished of its show. By the end of the week there remained only a handful of the duller and less desirable pieces, the minor saints, so to speak. Saturday night Mrs. Brandeis did a little figuring on paper. The lot had cost her $200. She had sold for $600. 2 from 6 leaves 4. $400! She repeated it to herself quietly. Her mind leaped back to the plush photograph album, then to young Bowder and his cool contempt, and there stole over her that warm, comfortable glow born of reassurance and triumph. $400. Not much in these days of big business. We said, you will remember, that it was a pitiful enough little trick she turned to make it, though an honest one, and, in the face of disapproval, a rather magnificent one, too, for it gave to Molly Brandeis that precious quality, self-confidence, out of which is born success. End of chapter 2.